The pen was already in his hand when she walked into the room, and that was the first thing she noticed. Not the woman beside him, not the gleam of the lamp on the polished mahogany, not the small stack of papers laid out with the deliberate neatness of a man who had practiced the gesture in private. The pen. Held the way a man holds a knife he intends to use before supper. He did not look up. He said only, without preamble, without the courtesy of her name, "Sign here, and we can all be spared an afternoon of unpleasantness." The woman beside him, dressed in a shade of green that had never in 3 centuries been considered modest, smiled the small private smile of someone who has already been promised the chair she stood behind. Beatrice had perhaps 4 seconds to decide what her face would do. She used 3 of them to count the candles on the mantel. There were 9. An odd number. She had always preferred odd numbers. They refused to be divided evenly, and she had come, over the long, slow years of this marriage, to feel a quiet kinship with anything that refused. On the 4th second, she smiled. Not broadly, not bitterly. The small, composed smile of a woman who had been waiting for a particular knock at a particular door, and had at last heard it, and found it lighter than she had feared. Henry, Duke of Ashbourne, did not notice. He had expected tears. He had braced for them the way a man braces against a wind he has summoned himself, and finding the air still, he frowned faintly, as though the weather had failed in its duty. The woman in green did notice. Her smile thinned by the smallest measure, the way a held breath thins when it has been held a moment too long. Beatrice took 1 step further into the room. The carpet was the aubusson her mother had sent on the occasion of the wedding, and she had walked across it so many times that her feet knew, without instruction, where the worn patch lay beneath the writing table. She avoided it now out of habit, as one avoids the loose floorboard in a house one has loved a long time and is preparing, quietly, to leave. "Read it," Henry said. He pushed the papers an inch toward her. The inch was meant to be magnanimous. Beatrice considered the inch. She considered the candles, the green dress, the small bronze clock on the mantel that had been wrong by 4 minutes for as long as she had been mistress of this house, and which no one had ever bothered to correct, because no one had ever bothered to listen when she pointed it out. She considered her own hands, which were steady, which surprised her, and which she folded loosely in front of her, as if she had come into the room to ask after the menu for dinner. "I have read it," she said. Her voice was low and clear, the voice she used with servants who had been frightened by someone louder. 3 times this week, in fact. Henry's head came up at last. There is a particular look a man wears when a piece of furniture he has been kicking turns and addresses him by name, and Henry wore it now, briefly, before he covered it with the practiced indifference of his class. "You have read it," he repeated, as though tasting the words for poison. "Yes, Mr. Halworth was kind enough to bring me a copy on Monday. He thought I should have time to consider." The woman in green stirred. The smallest movement of a slipper against the carpet, but Beatrice caught it, the way one catches the flick of a fish under still water. So Mr. Halworth, the family solicitor, who had handed the green woman down from the carriage not 10 minutes ago, had been writing letters at the same desk to his employer's wife. Beatrice noted this and filed it away, the way she filed everything, in the quiet, careful library of her mind, where the ledgers were always balanced and nothing was ever truly lost. Henry's color rose. Halworth had no business. "He had every business," Beatrice said evenly. "He has been my solicitor as well as yours since the day we married." My settlement is, after all, his concern. Henry set the pen down. It was the first sign she had won anything at all in this room, and she allowed herself, behind the composed face, to feel the small, warm flare of it, banked at once and tended carefully like a coal she meant to carry a long way. "Sit down," he said, because he needed her to do something he had ordered. She did not sit. "I will stand," she said. "I find I have been sitting rather a great deal of late." The green woman looked, for the first time, directly at her. There was a calculation in the look, swift and not unkind. The look of a woman appraising a horse she had been told was lame and finding it, against expectation, sound. Beatrice met the look. She did not smile again. She had used her smile already. One did not spend such things twice in a single afternoon. Henry began, in the patient tone he reserved for tenants and difficult dogs, to explain the document. The estate was entailed. The title was entailed. Certain monies were entailed. There were, however, sums that were not. There were houses that were not. There was, in particular, a small property in Wiltshire that had been part of her settlement, and which, he had been advised, could be returned to her in lieu of any further claim. She listened. She let him speak. She had learned, over the 7 years of their marriage, that Henry's sentences, like Henry's horses, ran themselves out if one did not interrupt them, and arrived eventually at a place from which one could politely lead them home. He arrived now at the word reasonable. He said it twice. He said, "I think you will find these terms reasonable." The bronze clock ticked. The candles guttered, then steadied. Somewhere, very faintly, beyond the closed door, a maid was singing in the back passage, a thread of a tune that had been new the year Beatrice came to this house as a bride, and was now, like Beatrice, no longer new. She tilted her head a fraction. "Reasonable," she repeated, as though she were holding the word up to the lamp to read its watermark. "It is an interesting word, Henry. It assumes there is a person to whom the terms are being offered who is in a position of reason rather than necessity. I am in such a position. I am glad we agree." The green woman's eyes flicked to Henry, the smallest possible flick, the way a partner at cards looks at the other when the hand is suddenly less certain than it had been a moment ago. Henry did not see it. Henry was watching Beatrice the way he had once watched a hawk at the edge of his glove, unsure whether it would fly to him or away. "Then you will sign," he said. Beatrice walked, at last, to the chair across from him. She did not sit. She rested one hand lightly on its back, the way a woman rests her hand on the shoulder of a friend who has begun to tremble. "I will sign nothing today," she said. The clock ticked, the candles steadied, the maid in the passage finished her tune and began another, and the woman in green, who had practiced her smile in the carriage on the way over from town, found that her face had quite forgotten what to do with it. Henry's mouth opened, then closed. He had prepared, in his careful way, for sorrow, for fury, for the kind of weeping into handkerchiefs that could be patted and packed off in a carriage. He had not prepared for a woman who would stand at the back of a chair and decline an inch of paper as if it had been a sweetmeat she did not care for. "You will not sign," he said, slowly, as though discovering the words for the first time in a foreign language. "Not today." The green woman, whose name was Lucinda, though Beatrice had no intention of speaking it aloud and granting it lodging in this room, drew a small, careful breath. She set her gloved hand on the edge of the desk, not on Henry's arm, which was a discretion that Beatrice noted and respected, even in the present circumstances. Lucinda had at least the wit to know whose house she was standing in, and that the deeds, however entailed, were not yet hers. "Perhaps," Lucinda said softly, in a voice trained for drawing rooms, "Her Grace would prefer to take the papers upstairs and consider them." "Her Grace," said Beatrice, "has considered them at length. Her Grace would prefer that the gentleman who brought them sit down and listen for the next quarter hour, after which Her Grace will retire to dress for dinner, which I believe is still at 7. Henry sat. He had not intended to sit. He sat the way a man sits when his knees decline to consult him. Beatrice stepped back from the chair. She walked slowly to the window, drew aside the curtain a finger's width, and looked out at the long drive where the rooks were already beginning to gather in the elms, as they did every evening at this hour with the punctuality of stewards. There were, she counted, 11 of them in the nearest tree. She did not know why she counted them. She had always counted them. Her mother had taught her, when she was very small, that one counted the rooks to keep one's wits about one, because rooks were as good as ledgers and held the eye steady. 11 was a good number, a prime, indivisible. She let the curtain fall. When she turned back to the room, her face was as it had been when she entered, composed, attentive, almost gentle. The face of a hostess about to suggest a small adjustment to the seating plan. "There are," she said, "3 things you have not considered, Henry. I will tell them to you now, in the order in which I think they will trouble you." He did not speak. He had the sense, dimly, of having stepped onto a path he had thought was his own land and discovering a fence. "The first," said Beatrice, "is the matter of Wycombe." Henry's face did not change. "The second is the matter of the bank. The third is the matter of your mother's pearls." At the third, Lucinda's gloved hand tightened, the smallest fraction, on the edge of the desk. Beatrice saw it and was sorry, in a distant, impersonal way, because she had nothing against Lucinda beyond what Lucinda had chosen, and one did not enjoy watching even a stranger's hand tighten on a desk that did not, in any meaningful sense, belong to her. "Wycombe," Beatrice said, "is the estate in Lincolnshire that you settled upon me at the time of our marriage, in lieu of a portion of my dowry which you preferred, at that time, to invest in the canal venture proposed by Lord Marbury. The canal, as you may recall, failed in the 3rd year. The settlement of Wycombe, as Mr. Halworth will confirm, did not. It produces, currently, a rent roll of £3,400 per annum, net of repairs." Henry's eyes went briefly to the papers on the desk, then back to her. He had the look of a man searching for a line he was certain he had read and could no longer find. "Wycombe," Beatrice continued, in the same even voice, "is not entailed. It is mine, outright, by the terms of the settlement. I mention it only because the document you wish me to sign contains, on the 3rd page, a clause by which I would assign my interest in Wycombe to the estate, in exchange for the small property in Wiltshire of which you spoke. The Wiltshire property, I am told, produces £420 per annum. I am not poor at arithmetic, Henry. I do not propose to make the exchange." The clock ticked. The maid had stopped singing. The room had, very faintly, the smell of the wax of the 9 candles and of the lavender Beatrice had instructed the housekeeper, on her arrival as a bride, to lay in the linen presses, and which had outlasted, by several years, the housekeeper. Henry breathed in, slowly, through his nose. "The bank," he said, in the tone of a man approaching a wall in the dark. Beatrice nodded, once. "The bank," she said. "You have, over the last 18 months, drawn against my Wycombe rents to the sum of, I believe, £2,600 in advances arranged through Mr. Halworth's office, with my consent and my signature beside yours. I gave the consent because you said the funds were required for the drainage at the home farm. I have since had occasion to look at the drainage. The drainage has not been done. The funds have, I am told, been spent in town. I do not propose to name the address." Lucinda did not move. She had perfected, in the carriage on the way out from town, a manner of standing in which her shoulders did not rise even when her breath did, and she practiced it now with the diligence of a woman whose livelihood had always depended upon being still in difficult rooms. Beatrice did not look at Lucinda. She looked at Henry. There was no triumph in her face. There was only the careful attention of a woman reading a long column of figures and arriving, at last, at the total she had expected. "The third matter," she said gently, "is your mother's pearls." Henry's hand, which had been flat upon the desk, lifted half an inch and settled again. It was the only thing his body did. But it was, Beatrice thought, an eloquent half-inch. "Your mother," she said, "gave me the pearls on the morning of our wedding. She brought them to my room herself. She put them around my neck with her own hands. She told me, in the words I have not forgotten, that they were not an heirloom of the Ashbourne estate, and that her own mother had given them to her and her mother before, and that they passed in the female line. From the woman of the house to the woman of the house, by gift and not by entail. She said, and I remember this also, that she gave them to me because she had no daughter of her own, and because she had decided, on meeting me, that I would do." Henry's face was very still. There was a thing inside it that he did not, perhaps, wish to look at directly, and Beatrice, who had loved him once, in a quiet, careful way that had been more like duty than fire, did not insist that he look. She only said, evenly, "The pearls are mine. They are in the safe in my dressing room. I have written, this morning, to Mr. Halworth, requesting that he formally record the gift in his ledger as a chattel of mine, supported by the testimony of Mrs. Penhaligon, who was your mother's lady's maid for 30 years, and who was present in the room. I do not propose to part with them. I mention them only because the document you wish me to sign contains, on the 5th page, a general clause assigning to the estate any item of jewelry held by me at the date of separation. I do not propose to assign." There was a silence. It was not the silence Henry had expected when he had laid out the candles and the pen and the inch of paper. It was a longer silence, and a quieter one, and it had the quality of a room into which a window has been opened upon a country that the inhabitants had not known lay beyond their wall. Beatrice let the silence hold. Henry did not fill it. After a long moment, Lucinda, who had been silent throughout, lifted her chin a fraction and spoke. "Your Grace," she said, and the address was formal and neutral, and given without irony, which Beatrice appreciated. "I have, perhaps, intruded upon a matter that requires more privacy than I can offer it. With your permission, I will withdraw to the morning room and wait for his Grace there." Beatrice considered her. Lucinda, in the lamp, looked younger than she had looked in the doorway, and her gown, which had seemed cunning a quarter of an hour before, looked merely cold. Beatrice felt, against her will, the smallest brush of pity, the kind of pity one feels for an animal one has not chosen to keep, and which has nonetheless come in out of the rain. "You may," said Beatrice, calmly. "The morning room is at the end of the corridor on the left. Mrs. Hales will bring you tea." Lucinda inclined her head and went, without looking again at Henry, which Beatrice noted, because a woman who does not look at her lover when she leaves a room has either already lost interest in him or has too much pride to be seen losing it, and either way is a woman who will survive what is coming. The door closed behind her with the soft click of a latch fitted by a careful joiner. Beatrice and Henry were alone. The candles had burned, now an inch lower. The bronze clock ticked. The rooks, beyond the window, were still arranging themselves in the elms, and there was, very faintly, the sound of the kitchen door slamming, 2 floors below, and the bark of one of the spaniels in the yard. The world, in short, went on with its evening, indifferent to the small constellation of human matters arranging themselves in the library. Beatrice came back to the chair across from Henry. This time, she sat. She arranged her skirts as she had been taught, and folded her hands in her lap, and waited, because she had said her piece, and the next move was his to make, and a great many of the long, slow lessons of her marriage had been lessons in waiting. Henry, at last, lifted his eyes to her. There was, in them, an expression she had not seen in a long while, and which she had no name for, not quite shame, not quite anger, not quite respect, something older than any of those. The look of a man who, having lived in a house all his life, walks one morning into a room he has never entered, and finds it furnished. "Why?" he said. It was not the question of the document. It was a different question. Beatrice understood which one. She did not pretend not to. "Because," she said, "I have been your wife for 7 years. In 7 years, one learns. One learns where the loose floorboards are. One learns the bronze clock is 4 minutes slow. One learns which of the servants will lie for you and which will lie to you. And one learns, eventually, that there is a great deal of difference between being underestimated and being unseen. I have been the first. I have not, I think, been the second, although you have arranged your life as if I were." Henry looked down at the pen. He picked it up. He did not write. He held it the way a man holds a tool he has discovered, late, is not the tool for the work. "I did not know about Wickham," he said. "You did," she answered, gently. "You signed the settlement yourself, in this room, the morning after our wedding. You were, I believe, a little tired. I have observed that men remember the marriages they wished they had made, and forget the settlements they did make, and I have not, in 7 years, found a remedy for it. I did not know about the pearls." "You knew," she said, more gently still. "Your mother told you, in my hearing, the week before she died. You were standing at that window. She said, 'Henry, the pearls go with Beatrice when she leaves this house, whether she leaves it in a carriage or a coffin.' You said, 'Mother, do not speak of leaving.' She said, 'I do not speak of leaving. I speak of pearls.' You laughed. We all laughed. It was, I think, the last time we laughed together in this room." Henry's hand tightened on the pen. "The drainage," he said. There was, in his voice, the faint thread of a man trying, even now, to retrieve a posture. "I did intend the drainage. I intend it still." "Then," said Beatrice, "evenly, perhaps, in the time to come, you will undertake it from your own purse. I cannot," she added, after a small pause, "advise you on which purse. I do not know your purses as well as I might." Henry set the pen down again. He looked at her, and there was, in his face, the dawning of an understanding which she had hoped might come earlier in their marriage, and which she received now without bitterness, because she had learned, also, that an understanding which arrives late is still an understanding, and is to be welcomed in the way one welcomes a guest who has been delayed by weather. "You are not going to sign," he said. "I am not going to sign that," she said. "I am willing to sign another document. One that, drawn properly, allows us both to leave this room with what is ours, and with what dignity remains. Mr. Halworth, I think, can draft it by the end of the week. I am," she added, "prepared to be generous, Henry, in matters where I am able to be." I am not prepared to be foolish." Henry was quiet a long time. The candles guttered. He reached out, at length, and pinched out the wick of the nearest one, which had begun to smoke, and the small, precise gesture was so familiar that Beatrice felt, against her will, the brief, sharp ache of a memory. The memory of the first year of their marriage, when he had done that same thing for her at this same desk every evening while she wrote letters, and had brought her, without being asked, a glass of barley water at 10. She set the memory down, carefully, as one sets down a piece of porcelain that is no longer in use, but is not yet ready to be put away. "There is," she said, at length, "one further matter." Henry looked up. It was not in his face now to brace himself. He had been braced too long, and the brace had given. He simply looked. "The child," said Beatrice. The word fell into the room like a small, clean stone into a deep well. For a moment, Henry did not seem to have heard it. Then he heard it. His mouth opened, and closed, and opened again, and Beatrice, who had not meant to deliver the matter quite so plainly, found that she was not sorry she had. There was no other shape in which it would have fit. "The child," she said again, "will be born, by my reckoning, in the 3rd week of January. I have known since Michaelmas. I have told no one but Mrs. Penhaligon, who has had the discretion of 40 years in the service of this family, and may be trusted to have the discretion of one further winter. I tell you now because the document on the desk between us, as drawn, makes no provision for a child, and I do not propose to sign a document that overlooks an heir." Henry's hand had come up, slowly, and was resting against his mouth. He did not speak. He looked at her as a man looks at a country he has been told is barren, and finds, beyond the next ridge, a river. After a long moment, he said, very quietly, "You are certain?" "I am," she said, "certain. Mrs. Penhaligon is also certain, and Mrs. Penhaligon, as you know, has been certain of these things in this house for 40 years, and has not, in my hearing, been mistaken." He sat back. The chair, which was old and complained. He passed his hand over his face. It was, she observed without pleasure, the gesture of a man whose own architecture has shifted under him, and she felt, once again, the small, unwilling brush of pity. Because she had loved him once, and because love, even when it has been carefully set down, leaves a faint warmth in the hand that held it. "I did not know," he said. "I had not given you," said Beatrice, occasion to know. "You have been, of late, much in town." He flushed. It was the first honest color his face had taken in the whole long afternoon. Beatrice did not press the advantage. She had not raised the matter of the child to wound him. She had raised it because the document required it, and because she was a woman who had decided, somewhere on the long carpet between the door and the chair, that whatever else was lost in this room today, the small unknown person of January would not be among the things lost. "The document," said Henry, after a long moment, "was drawn upon the understanding that there was no issue." "The document," said Beatrice, "was drawn upon a number of understandings I should be glad to revise." She let the words sit. She did not soften them. She did not need to. The room was soft enough. Beyond the window, the rooks had settled. The light had gone, in the way it goes in the country in late November, all at once, so that the lamps which had been a luxury an hour ago were now a necessity. Mrs. Hales, somewhere below stairs, would be lighting the dining room. There would be soup in 20 minutes, the world insisted, with its small, honest punctuality ongoing on. Henry stood. He did it slowly, the way an older man stands, although he was not yet old. He walked to the window where his mother had stood the week before she died, and he looked out at the elms. Beatrice watched the back of him and did not speak. After a long while, he said, without turning, "What would you have me do?" The question, asked in that voice, was not the question of the document. It was a larger and more uncomfortable question, and Beatrice took her time over it, because she did not wish to answer it lightly. "I would have you," she said, at length, "withdraw the papers on the desk. I would have you instruct Mr. Halworth to draft, in their place, a deed of separation that recognizes Wakeham as mine, recognizes the pearls as mine, recognizes the child as yours and as an heir to the estate to the extent the entail permits, and provides for me and for the child a maintenance proportionate to your means and to the dignity of the family name. I would have you settle, separately and privately, with the lady who is at present in the morning room, whatever arrangement you deem appropriate, but I would have you do so out of your own funds and not out of mine, and I would have you do so somewhere other than this house, where your mother taught me to keep the linens and to count the rooks and to expect, in due time, a measure of respect from the man she gave me to. He did not turn. His shoulders, beneath the dark coat, had a stillness that was not the stillness of a man at peace. It was the stillness of a man who had been struck and was waiting, with what dignity he had, for the second blow not to come. Beatrice did not strike again. She had not, after all, come into the room to strike. She had come into the room to sign nothing, and she had signed nothing, and there was no further blow required. After another long moment, Henry said, "And Wakeham?" "Wakeham," said Beatrice, gently, "I propose, with your permission, to remove there in the spring, after the child is born. I propose to take with me Mrs. Penhaligon and the nurse, and whichever of the under-servants would prefer Wickham to Ashbourne. I propose to leave the house in good order. I propose to write to you, at intervals, of the child's health. I propose, if you wish it, to receive you there at such times as you may wish to visit. I do not propose to receive anyone else." He turned. At last, his face was tired in a way she had not seen it before, the tiredness of a man who has carried a thing a long way without knowing he was carrying it. "The pen," he said with the smallest of smiles, which was not a happy smile, but was, she observed with a small, unwilling tenderness, an honest one. "The pen is, I take it, not for signing today." "The pen," said Beatrice, returning the smile by the smallest possible measure, "is for writing to Mr. Halworth. I have," she added, "taken the liberty of preparing a note. It is in the drawer of my writing desk in the morning room. You will find, I think, that the language is clear." Henry looked at her a long moment. There was, in the look, no anger and no fondness, and nothing very much that could be called by a single name. There was, perhaps, the look of a man who had spent a long time mistaking a room for a corridor, and discovering at last that it was a room, and that there had been chairs in it all along. He said, very quietly, "You are a remarkable woman, Beatrice." She inclined her head, the smallest possible inclination, and did not answer. She had been told this once before, by his mother, in this room, the night before the wedding, and she had not believed it then and was not certain she believed it now. But she received the words as one receives a gift one has not asked for and does not need, courteously, without unwrapping them. He picked up the pen. He picked up the papers. He folded them with the same precise neatness with which he had laid them out, and he tucked them inside his coat. He walked to the door. At the door he paused. He did not look back at her. He said only, "Will you dine?" "I will dine," said Beatrice. "At 7, as we have done." He nodded once and went out. The door closed behind him with the same soft click. Beatrice sat alone in the library. The 9 candles burned. The bronze clock ticked, 4 minutes slow, as it had for 7 years. Outside, the rooks had gone quiet. Inside her, very faintly, almost imperceptibly, the small unknown person of January turned, the way a sleeper turns at the sound of a door closing in a distant part of the house, and was still. She did not weep. She had not wept in the afternoon, and she did not weep now, when there was no one to see her either weep or not weep. Which is, she had long thought, the truer test. She sat very still in the chair, and she let her hands rest in her lap, and she allowed herself, at last, the small private luxury of feeling, in order, each of the things she had been holding at a distance for the length of the long, bright afternoon. She felt, first, the absence of the marriage as it had been described to her at the beginning. The version with the barley water and the pinched candle wicks and the laughter in this very room when his mother spoke of pearls. She felt that absence as one feels the absence of a tooth one has lived with a long time and has at last had drawn. A tenderness, an emptiness, a relief. She felt, second, the presence of the child. She did not yet feel it as weight. The child was too small, still, to be weight. She felt it as a quiet attention, the attention of a small, candid witness who would, in time, ask her questions she had not yet learned to answer. She felt, third, the strange, clean cold of having said aloud, in a room where it could not be unsaid, things she had carried in silence for the better part of a year. The cold was not unpleasant. It was the cold of a window opened in a stuffy room. After a while, Mrs. Penhaligon knocked in her particular way. 3 small knocks, and then a pause, and then a fourth, and came in without waiting for an answer, because she had known Beatrice long enough to know that on days such as this one, an answer was not always available. Mrs. Penhaligon did not look at the candles, or the desk, or the rooks beyond the window. She looked at Beatrice, briefly and entirely. The way a doctor looks at a patient who has come back from a long fever, and she nodded once to herself. "She has gone," Mrs. Penhaligon said, of the lady in green, which was as much as she would ever in her life say of the lady in green. "His Grace has ridden out." Beatrice received this without surprise. "Where?" she said, mildly. "To the home farm," said Mrs. Penhaligon, with a small dry note that no one but Beatrice would have caught. "To inspect, I understand, the drainage." Beatrice's mouth moved briefly in something that was almost a smile. She said, "I see." "And dinner," said Mrs. Penhaligon, "will be at 7 in the small dining room. I have instructed cook that you will take a little of the consomme and a little of the chicken, and that the savory may be omitted." Beatrice nodded. She rose, slowly, because she had been sitting a long time, and the room had grown cold, and she was carrying, now, a passenger who required, even at this early stage, certain courtesies. She crossed to the window and looked out. The rooks were a single black shape in the elms, indistinguishable now from the branches that held them. The drive was empty. The lamps along the front of the house had been lit. She drew the curtain, fully against the dark. As she turned back into the room, her eye fell upon the bronze clock. She crossed to it and opened the small glass door, and with the tip of one finger, very gently, she advanced the minute hand 4 minutes, so that it told, for the first time in 7 years, the true time. Mrs. Penhaligon, in the doorway, watched her do it and did not speak, because there are some small ceremonies between women which do not require commentary. Beatrice closed the glass door. She offered Mrs. Penhaligon her arm, which was an old joke between them from a winter, in which Beatrice had sprained an ankle and been obliged to lean on the older woman to descend the stairs, and Mrs. Penhaligon, with the dignity of 40 years in the service of the house, took it, and they went out together, leaving the candles to burn down in the empty room. Dinner was quiet. Henry, returning from his inspection of a drainage that did not exist, ate little and spoke less. Beatrice spoke, mildly, of small matters. A letter from her sister, a question about the orchard, the progress of the new curate, who was, she said, a young man of great seriousness and uncertain Latin. Henry, who had always rather enjoyed correcting other people's Latin, did not rise to the bait, and she did not press it. After dinner, he excused himself to the library, where, she understood, he wrote a letter to Mr. Halworth, the contents of which were never spoken aloud between them, and never needed to be. She, for her part, went up to her dressing room, where she opened the safe and looked, briefly, at the pearls, not to wear them, but to ensure they were as she had left them, and then closed the safe again, and went to bed. She did not lie awake. She had expected, all that day, to lie awake at the end of it, and she had been prepared, in the careful way she prepared for everything, with a book and a lamp and a glass of barley water, the last of which she had had Mrs. Penhaligon prepare with a small, private smile, because it was the first glass of barley water she had asked for in 7 years. In the event, she did not need any of these things. She put out the lamp and turned upon her side and slept, deeply, the sleep of a woman who has set down a great weight she did not know she was carrying. The papers were withdrawn. Mr. Halworth, on receipt of his employer's letter, traveled out from town the following week with an underclerk and a quantity of foolscap, and the three of them, with Beatrice and Henry by turns, sat in the library where the 9 candles had burned, and they drew, line by careful line, a new document. It recognized Wickham as Beatrice's own. It recognized the pearls as Beatrice's own. It recognized the child, when it should come, as the heir of the Ashbourne estate to the full extent permitted by the entail, with such further provision out of the unentailed funds as was, in the circumstances, reasonable, which was a word Mr. Halworth used with a small, dry inflection that Beatrice noticed, and Henry, for the first time in his life, also noticed. It provided for Beatrice's removal to Wickham in the spring, with an establishment proper to her station, and for an annual visit by his grace at such time as should be mutually convenient. It made no mention of the lady in the green dress, who had by then returned to town in a hired carriage, and whose subsequent arrangements were, as Beatrice had insisted, settled out of his grace's own purse and at a tactful distance. The document was signed in the library on a clear, cold morning in early December, with the 9 candles unlit because the sun was bright through the long windows and Mrs. Penhaligon as witness, and the bronze clock telling, for once, the true time. Beatrice signed her name slowly. She had been taught, as a girl, to write a fine hand, and she wrote it now, the long, looped capital, the careful, even letters, the firm closing line. She handed the pen to Henry. He took it, and he too signed slowly, and he too, when he had finished, looked at his signature for a moment before he set the pen down, as though he had not quite recognized the name. Mr. Halworth blotted both signatures with sand, which was old-fashioned of him, and which Beatrice had always found pleasing, and gathered the papers, and bowed, and went away. Henry stood at the window for a long moment afterwards, looking out at the elms. He did not turn when he spoke. "I shall miss you at Wickham," he said. He did not say "I shall come often," which would have been a lie they both knew. He said only, "I shall miss you," which was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Beatrice, who was tidying her gloves, did not answer at once. After a moment, she said, "You have a standing invitation, Henry. You will find Wickham a quiet house. You may find it does you good." He nodded, once, without turning, and that was the end of it. The winter passed. Beatrice grew slowly into her condition, and was kept indoors more than she would have liked, and read a great deal, and wrote to her sister, and walked, on the milder days, in the long gallery, which had been built by an ancestor of Henry's for precisely such purposes. Although, in his case, the inhabitant in question had been a gouty uncle. The child was born in the 3rd week of January, as Beatrice had predicted, on a clear, bitter night when the elms were black with frost and the rooks were silent. It was a boy. He was healthy. Beatrice held him for a long while before she gave him to the nurse, and she counted his fingers. Because she had been taught by her mother to count, and she found, with a small private pleasure, that there were 10. An even number. She did not mind on this occasion that it was even. She had decided, lying there with him in the crook of her arm, that she would, after all, learn to be at peace with even numbers, because they were the numbers of partnership. And she had at last entered into a partnership in which she felt herself an equal half. Henry came up from town at once. He sat by the bed, and he held the child, awkwardly, the way a man holds an instrument he has not been taught to play. He looked at his son for a long time, and then he looked at Beatrice, and he said, very quietly, "What shall we call him?" He had not asked her any question in quite that tone in 7 years. She said, "I have thought, perhaps, Edmund, after your father, if you do not mind." He did not mind. Edmund it was. In the spring, as she had said she would, Beatrice removed to Wickham. She took Mrs. Penhaligon and the nurse and the under-housemaid Sarah, who had asked, with the courage of a young woman who knew her own mind, to come, and a footman who had served the family since he was a boy, and who had a sister settled in the nearest village to Wickham. She did not take the bronze clock. She left it on the mantel in the library, telling, now, the true time, where Henry, who had never quite forgiven himself for not having corrected it, kept it wound. Wickham was a small house compared to Ashbourne, but it was sound and warm, and the gardens, neglected for a generation, responded to Beatrice's quiet attention with the gratitude of any old thing long overlooked. Edmund grew. He was a sober child, and watchful, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's long hands, and he learned to count rooks, in time, at his mother's knee. Henry visited, in the 1st year, twice, in the 2nd, 3 times, in the 3rd, often enough that the question of frequency ceased to be one Beatrice tracked. He did not, in those visits, attempt to revisit anything that had been said in the library on the November afternoon of the 9 candles. He came as a guest. He left as a guest. He was, in the small, confined, courteous way of guests, welcome, as for the others. Mr. Halworth retired, in the year of Edmund's 5th birthday, to a small house in Kent, where he was reported to have taken up the cultivation of roses, with much the same patient exactitude he had once devoted to settlements. The roses, it was said, declined to be hurried, and he was much pleased with them. Mrs. Penhaligon died, peacefully, in her own bed at Wickham, in the 11th year of Beatrice's residence there, having lived long enough to see Edmund off to school and to pronounce, on the morning of his departure, that he would do. The lady in the green dress, Beatrice was told, by a cousin of her sister's who took an unwholesome interest in such matters, married. Some 4 years after the afternoon of the papers, a manufacturer of buttons in the north, and was reported, at last accounts, to be prospering, to have 3 children of her own, and to wear, in defiance of all advice, green at every opportunity. Beatrice, on hearing this, smiled, briefly, and wished her well, in a private, impersonal way that surprised her by being entirely sincere. The bronze clock in the library at Ashbourne continued to tell the true time, and was, after Henry's death, many years later, inherited along with the rest of the estate by Edmund, who, on his first inspection of his father's house as its master, opened the small glass door and looked inside, and finding it accurate to the minute, closed it again and let it be. And so we leave them, you and I, by the fire that has burned, all this long while, very quietly at our backs. If you have ever stood in a room where someone you trusted laid out a stack of papers and a pen and a calm assumption of your defeat, and felt, against all expectation, not the tears you had braced for, but a strange, clear calm, as though the room had at last become honest, then you have stood, for a moment, where Beatrice stood, by the back of the chair, with her hand resting lightly upon it. If you have ever counted candles, or rooks, or the small steady numbers of your own life to keep your wits about you in a difficult hour, then you know already why she counted, and why she smiled, and why the smile was not, in the end, a triumph, but a recognition. Tell me, before you go, which moment stayed with you? Was it the inch of paper pushed across the desk, or the curtain drawn aside upon the 11 rooks, or the 4 minutes given back to a clock that had told the wrong hour for 7 years? Was it the small, unknown person of January, turning at the sound of a distant door? Was it the line about the pearls, given by a dying mother in a room full of laughter, or the line about the barley water, brought without being asked, in a year that is now very far away? Sit with it a moment. The fire does not mind. If you have found, in this hour by the hearth, that the story warmed you in the way old stories warm, then draw your chair a little closer for the next one. There will be another when the candles are trimmed and the kettle is on, and I shall be here to tell it in the same low voice to whoever has the patience to listen. Stay, if you can. Come back, if you cannot. Until then, may your own clocks tell the true time, and may the rooks in your own elms be an honest number, and may you, when the pen is offered, know exactly which document you will sign, and which you will not. Good night, my friend. Good night.